Hi and welcome back. I really need to clean my palette, but I don't want to waste the paint, so first of all I'm going to wet it all and scrub it up and use it for a painting. With my hake brush, just to get it nice and wet. Now I'm using some clean water to wet my paper, and this time I'm not wetting it all over. I'm leaving some gaps, mostly in the foreground but some in the sky too. I'm loading up my brush with just that mixed up paint, just from cleaning the palette, sort of a greeny palette grey I call it. There's a few different tones in there, some slightly darker, so now I'm just going to use the fact that the board is tilted. It's virtually standing upright for filming, so you can see all the paint running down, so I'm using gravity to allow the paint to softly diffuse. And now I've got a good coverage. I think I'll try and stop it from running down any further by turning the board around, which will mean, as you can see, that it starts to run in that direction across the page for a smoother looking wash. Just mop up any beads of water and paint that drip down towards the bottom there. And now that it's a bit more stable, I'm just pulling out a horizon line. This painting is going to be of the River Cuckmere, so I want a nice low horizon line here. Now while the paint's still wet, the paper's still got a sheen on it, so I can work on it, I'm just going to put a little bit more paint across the foreground, slightly darker in streaks running across that way. I still want it to diffuse into the rest because I'm not looking for anything dramatic at this stage. Just a nice, soft, even wash. Something that will make a really good underpainting for the next stages. Just keep adding slightly darker paint, making sure that it's not too wet so you don't want to get cauliflowers, and just build up a little bit more tone across the foreground. Just going to soften it now across the horizon, just to make it a little bit softer, just to keep the look of distance so that it's not too harsh across the horizon. Now just before it dries I want to put in my river. So I'm squeezing all the water out of a clean hake brush, and my sky is roughly going in that direction, so I want my river, to come in the sort of opposite direction across the foreground. So I'm just going to lift out the shape of the river with the dry damp brush, making it slightly wider towards the right hand side where it's closer. And just using the chisel edge of the hake brush, I'm going to put just a couple of very thin lines in, just to give the illusion of some distance. And that's about it now. I'm going to leave it to dry completely. Right, it's completely dry, so now I've taken a bit more of that palette greeny grey, very watery. I'm just going to use the hake brush just to put in some distant hills, rolling South Downs that make such a beautiful backdrop to the River Cuckmere. Try to use very clean, fast, gentle strokes, as few strokes as you can to get these in, to keep them nice and clean, and then use a damp brush just to feather it out at the bottom so you don't get hard edges. So with the distant hills looking very pale, we get a good sense of distance. Now with the tips of the hake brush I'm just using some darker colour. I think it's a combination of sepia and indigo, maybe a bit of Paynes grey, just to actually define the riverbank in places a little, putting some darker marks just across the banks. and some lighter marks as well, using burnt sienna and the yellow ochre. Just dipping in and out of the paint and just putting in some marks, and then beginning to build up the foreground for some impressions of rough grasses, etc., etc. Here I'm dipping into various combinations of the paints that I've got on my palette now, which I shall list below for you, and various thicknesses, just to paint in the foreground until I feel that it sort of looks balanced and gives the impression of what I want. I'm not going to paint in detail. I'm just trying to suggest that this is the close bank. The foreground will have the darkest colours. I just want to do the midground now, and I'm just going to use very pale paint to dry brush very simply across there. That's all I'm going to do for the midground. I want the eye just to stop more or less at the river. And while that dry brush stroke is wet, I'm just going to tweak it a little bit, drop in a little bit of paint here and there, nothing too strong, just to vary the colour a tiny bit, just to add a little bit of interest, but without being too distracting. And at this sort of stage of the painting, as I always say, it's just a matter of just looking at it and thinking where it needs maybe the addition of a little bit of colour, maybe a bit of dark in somewhere or a little bit of lighter colour somewhere else. And every painting will be different, your painting will be different, and this is where eventually, the more you practice, you'll just get used to being able to see what the painting needs without fiddling too much or overdoing it. Oops, board's a bit crooked, straighten it, try and get that straightened up a bit. Maybe a bit more detail in the front, and try some indigo, in the foreground. Not sure about that actually. I think I'll just use the damp brush just to maybe soften that area down a bit. I don't want it quite so speckly there, because that draws the eye too much. That's better. Now I'm just going to use some of that light palette greeny grey, just to put a little bit of tone into the water of the river. I don't need too much, just a little tiny bit, so that it's sort of reflecting the colour in the sky. I'm just going to now just dot in a bit more dark colour on the riverbank, and allow it to run down a little bit for some pale reflections, nothing too strong, but just to diffuse into the wet river area, and we'll just see what happens there. Right, I'm just going to now mix up a sort of a dark mixture with my darker colours, and use the rigger to put in just a suggestion of some broken fencing and maybe gates on the far side of the river. One of the features of the flooded landscape of the River Cuckmere at Cuckmere Haven is there's just so many little broken down, poorly maintained fences, which are so charming and wonderful to paint. So that's what I'm going to be putting across the river. I'm just trying to be quite scribbly and scratchy with it, because I don't want it to look too perfect. leaving quite large gaps. I don't want the fence to just run all the way along the riverbank, just a bit of a fence here and a bit there. I don't want it to look too regimented. A little bit more just over this side here. Just keeping it rough. Now I'm looking at my near bank here, and I think it's just it's not quite what I wanted it to be. So while it's still wet, I'm going to use the card and just sweep the card across, pressing fairly hard, and just see if I can unify it a bit, because it's just the loose marks there haven't quite worked. That's a bit better, but I think maybe it needs to be darkened up a bit still. So with the hake brush, I'm just taking a slightly darker mixture of paint, and I'm just going to sweep it like cloud shadow all the way across the foreground, and that's better. That's even more, it's unified it even more. I'm quite happy with that. Right, I'm going to finish it off just above this fence area here, I think, with some birds over towards the right hand side. Not many, and keep them nice and small using the rigger brush and some darkish paint. I'm just going to scatter them around in a way that I feel kind of leads the eye into the painting a bit more. One there on the white area of white paper, so it stands out nicely. If they turn out a bit dark, you can just use a bit of tissue just to carefully dab off some of the paint. And I think that's it. I think that's finished. I mean, you could add a bit more detail if you wanted to. Maybe a couple of slightly larger trees, maybe some trees on the far bank on the left-hand side or something like that. Maybe a few more birds. But I'm going to leave it there. I quite like the way this has turned out. Certainly better than just washing all that paint off my palette and wasting it. If you look quite closely, you can see the detail. It's quite nice. The rough old fences, the dry brush, the faint pale distant hills. So thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this, maybe follow the link to have a look at my Patreon page, where I do several videos a week, either tips, techniques or tutorials. Anyway, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon. Take care, stay safe and happy painting. See you soon. Bye.